Our Palm Sunday in a congregation where I would guess most of you, if not all of you, could kind of care less about the Christian story. Most of us aren't coming from a Christian orientation. And so I bring this with all humility and with hoping that this story lends truth beyond just the Christian tradition, that it brings something for each of us. So you tell me if something landed. That's my hope in preaching today from this story. You know, when we start with Palm Sunday and this story of Jesus coming into Jerusalem, my favorite interpretation of it, or way to wrestle with it, or the way that it's meaningful for me, is that Jesus was coming into the city in a way that was a parody of what the Roman Empire would do. So the Roman Empire consistently paraded their leaders into the city of Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jewish people that the Romans occupied. So let's just keep the political reality of Jerusalem in those days in mind, that this was an occupied state, and not happily so. You know, things that had happened there was not right around this time. The Romans had taken Galilean Jews and had brought them into the temple and murdered them in their own temple. There was all this infighting amongst the Jewish people, amongst the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Herodians. And so there was just an incredible amount of tension that is the context for this story. So for Jesus to come in to town on a colt with some coats thrown about was really making fun of what the Romans would do, which was incredibly elaborate, ornate, almost ridiculously lavish parades, political parades into Jerusalem. And so in that sense, it was Jesus kind of saying, you want to see a parade? I'll give you a parade. This is how I do parades. Now, the other point of that's my favorite interpretation, but the other point of tension that we have to really acknowledge here is that we really have no historical data, real facts that this even happened, right? So that's important, I think, to acknowledge that there is some real questioning the historicity of this story that we're telling today. Which to me kind of rings of like, okay, is this fake news? Or is this, like one of my seminary professors would say, well, a myth is just a truth that can't be told any other way. So I just ask all of us to kind of hold this in tension, that the story that I just told you, as compelling and awesome as I think it is fraught with, some questions that absolutely should be there. You know, the most simple way to question this is that a common man, like Jesus really was, I mean, the way that he presented during those times, is that he would be coming into Jerusalem on a colt during the festival season, during the first days of Passover, coming into town, and people shouting, Hosanna in the highest, quoting Psalms. Like, that's not special. For that, that happened. People came into Jerusalem for a Passover. Pilgrims from the countryside came in. There was, people shouting, welcome, So all of that is not extraordinary for this particular time and place. What we do know, here's the facts that we do know. that historical scholars have been able to verify is that Jesus did live during these times, that he did speak widely about the empire and widely and critically about the empire of God as being distinct from, is importantly and essentially distinct from the empire of Rome. And here I want to, I think it obviously to me brings to the reading that you shared, this economy, this gift economy versus this cannibal economy. That's what Jesus was pointing toward. I think this a similar tension of what is the empire of God, of how we really care for one another, and how that is at the essence of who Jesus saw the importance of the Jewish people being to care for one another, as starkly standing up against and in contrast to the Roman Empire and their values and what was happening in this occupied state. So we know that Jesus did that. We know that he spoke about those things. Another thing that we know is that, I mean, it's a reasonable guess by all the standards of historical investigation that Jesus would have come to Jerusalem during the festival of Passover. That's reasonable. That's what good Jews did in his time. They would go to Jerusalem for the festival. And it's reasonable, given that Jesus had these values that he had, that he would walk into the city and be, to say the least, disappointed at what was happening in the temple. And it is possible, it is reasonable to assume that what he did as a result of that disappointment, the actions that he may have taken, could have easily got him arrested. And he would have been tried for sedition, and then we have the evidence, we have a lot of historical evidence to support that he was crucified. So then the question comes to me, out of just intellectual curiosity, but also faithful curiosity. If that's all we know, why was this story told, perhaps created is a better way to put it, by the people who wrote it? This story in Luke was written around the year 70, which is the year that the temple was destroyed by the Roman Empire. It was no longer just violated and desecrated, it was destroyed in the year 70. And that's when the words that you heard today, that story was written by people that I can only imagine were heartbroken and trying to make sense of the trauma that they had just experienced. Not only the trauma of the temple being destroyed, but also the trauma of worshiping the person they believed was God had been murdered. All of these things are arguably not good news to a faithful people. Not supportive, not affirming, not motivating, not inspiring. Heartbreaking, period. And so we have this story that they told that is about an innocent, a pure being from their faith that embodied the very best of their tradition, who courageously and boldly walked into their city, into their temple, and spoke with a pure heart about what must be seen and what truth must be told. And within this, they used the Psalms to support this. They used the Passover, halal. Yeah, they used the prophetic tradition and Zechariah. They pulled from all of those to support the story they needed to tell, which was of a victim and a villain and a hero. And that's the story they created. That's the story that we have today. But it's also important to know that this story that they created, I would guess completely unbeknownst to them, has been used for generations of anti-Semitism. Because the way that this has been boiled generations after them, but not that many generations after them, it started to be boiled down into Jews killed Jesus. That this very complicated story got boiled down to that. So given all this, why does this story even matter to us today? Why does it matter? We could easily just like toss it aside and move on with our lives as we've got them. But part of what has really landed for me this year when I've reflected on the festival of Passover is that this is a story about God, of celebrating what God did in the past, the saving power of what God did in the past. It's not so much bargaining with God, like, and this is what you're going to do in the future or else. It's really like, this is how God saved and freed us in the past, and what we have, the evidence that we have to look back on to give us potential hope for the future. And it's undeniably a story about death and rebirth. I mean, that is the whole story of Easter anyway, within the Christian tradition, that things die, things are born, this is what's happening in the earth, it's affirmed throughout all of our lives. We're letting go, we're welcoming new things to come to life. And so I would ask each of us to look at what it is that you are having to let go of at this particular time in your life. What are the losses? What are the parts of you, kind of like an acorn shell that no longer serves you, that you have to break open and release so that more can grow? These parts of our personality that we sometimes identify with and get calcified around, that actually don't serve the next, they had served a certain purpose of protecting us, but now we have to keep growing. How do we release? How do we keep opening? There are a couple things from the story that I want to return to before I close. One is that in the story, Jesus walks into Jerusalem and it's kind of like a protest march. Like they're chanting, like there's all this activity, there's some tension. And imagine, if you will, I trust all of us have been to a good protest march or two, I hope. Imagine the central figure of that protest march arriving to the destination. And what do you expect of somebody, like the key figure, the headliner for a protest march? You expect them to be the loudest chanting, to give this incredible speech. And what did Jesus do? He burst into tears. He wept to see the temple and to see Jerusalem in the state that it was. And I will lift this up because I think this is an important time for all of us to look at how we're called into action and how we're called into vitality and passion and dedication, and how we're also called into tears, to heartbreak, to acknowledge the loss. And both of these can be true in the same moment, the same time. The other piece of this story is that stones will shout. Do you remember that when the people were saying like, hey, quiet your people down? And Jesus was like, what am I gonna do? Like, even if I did tell them to be quiet, the stones would shout. And the way that I read that is that this is at the foundation of who we are as human beings. This is at the foundation of the earth, that these truths must be told. This is not about being quieting one person or another, taking the money or the grant away. Just as you said, the work will be done. Whether the money is there or not, the stones will shout. And if you are at all questioning what the stones will shout, you need look no further than your covenant. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its prayer, to dwell together in peace, to seek the truth in love, and to help one another. Those are the values of this congregation that I would say are deeper than any one of you as individuals, and deeper than this particular congregation. They go all the way to the cornerstones of who we are as faithful people. Amen. Let us join our voices together and sing hymn in the teal hymnal 1018, Come and Go with Me.